They thought she was invisible. Seat 22C, just another face in a hoodie, sneakers frayed, a tote bag hugged too close. The businessmen in polished suits sneered, the influencer laughed for her live stream, and even the flight attendants dismissed her as nobody. To them, she didn't belong. She was a smudge on their perfect flight from New York to Washington. But skies have long memories. When the captain's voice cracked with tension, when panic rippled through the cabin, and two fighter jets streaked into view, the woman in 22C finally opened her eyes, calm, unshaken. And in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she spoke the words that silenced them all. "They're here for me." What the world saw that day was not a stranger in a faded hoodie. It was the return of a legend the military had declared dead 7 years ago. Her name was Hoa Karen, call sign Night Falcon 22. The boarding line was impatient that morning, a coiled rope of business suits, glossy handbags, and rolling carry-ons clicking against the floor tiles. The New York to Washington, D.C. shuttle was always like this, an air corridor for those who thought themselves important, where every wristwatch sparkled with brand names and every phone call barked of deals, deadlines, and power. People in the line craned their necks as though one glance could establish their rank against another. Nobody noticed the young woman moving quietly at the back, her head slightly bowed beneath the fluorescent glare. Hoa Karen carried nothing but a faded tote bag pressed against her ribs, the strap worn thin. Her hoodie had been washed too many times, its gray fabric soft at the elbows, its cuffs frayed. Her jeans were sun-faded, patched at the knees, her sneakers scuffed white with frayed laces that had once been blue. Her hair, dark and thick, was pulled into a haphazard ponytail that hadn't seen a brush that morning. No foundation or lipstick to soften her features. She looked like someone out of place, a shadow stitched into a corridor of light. When she handed over her ticket, the gate agent glanced twice, as though expecting her boarding pass to be counterfeit. Karen said nothing. She was used to that glance, the look that scanned her clothes, her bag, her silence, and drew conclusions before her name was even spoken. She walked down the jet bridge with her tote clutched close, as if that scrap of fabric was the only anchor between her and a world that had forgotten her. The plane's cabin was a hum of voices and perfume. Suits already tucked into aisle seats raised their eyes at her, judging in a heartbeat. She moved toward the back of economy to seat 22C by the window. As she slid into her seat, her tote never left her grasp, her body curling slightly toward the window like a leaf against glass. She closed her eyes before the first whisper reached her. It came from across the aisle, a businessman named Graham. Mid-40s, jaw sharp from years of chewing through boardrooms, tie cinched so tight it looked like it might strangle him. His watch gleamed deliberately each time he moved his wrist. He leaned toward the man beside him, another finance-bred commuter named Derek, and smirked. "They'll let anyone on these flights now," he said, his voice pitched just enough to carry. He nodded toward 22C. "Look at her. Doesn't even look like she belongs in the terminal." Derek chuckled, adjusting his cufflinks. "Bet she scraped her last dime for that seat." Their laughter was soft, but not soft enough. Karen's fingers twitched on her tote, brushing the zipper. She did not open her eyes. The first round of laughter sparked the second. 2 rows up, Kayla, a 20-something influencer with highlighted hair and a phone clamped like a second limb, perked up at the opportunity. She angled her camera, whispering in sugary tones to her thousands of online followers. "Guys, check seat 22C. Like, does she even know where she is?" Total bargain bin vibes. Her chat erupted with emoji storms, laughing faces, clapping hands, gifs of scruffy animals. She giggled, eyes glittering, and tilted her camera for another angle. Karen's chest rose and fell steadily. Her lips remained still, as if she had drifted far away from the voices pressing against her. Claudia, a corporate consultant in a navy sheath dress with nails lacquered the color of garnets, leaned back in her seat, her words sharp enough to cut glass. "Probably one of those PR charity cases airlines use. It's almost offensive to sit here with us." She flipped her hair, her earrings flashing under the cabin lights. The man beside her chuckled, nodding. Their smiles were the kind born from power lunches, an endless victory over smaller people. Across the aisle, Eleanor, diamond bracelet glittering, whispered to her husband Richard as he scrolled on his phone. "She doesn't belong here. Probably on the wrong flight." Richard didn't even look up. or on the wrong planet. They chuckled, practiced, and cruel. The chorus grew, a hum of dismissive voices filling the air like smoke. A flight attendant passed. His name tag read Marcus, his buzz cut rigid, his posture military, but without the honor. He dropped a plastic cup of water onto Karen's tray table with a slap of plastic against metal, harder than necessary. Water, he said. Curt, his glare saying more. Nuisance, problem, waste of a seat. The cup trembled slightly where it landed. Karen's hand slid to steady it. She did not look up. The cabin chuckled as though on cue, a shared breath of superiority. Their words layered on each other like dust, sticking to her presence. Seat 22C was no longer a person. It was a blot, an inconvenience, something to point at and laugh away. Karen kept her eyes closed, her breath even. But inside her chest, behind the silence, a storm shifted its weight. When the engines rumbled and the plane lifted off the runway, conversations swirled around champagne flutes and stock prices. Kayla whispered to her stream, spinning jokes for her audience. Graham spoke loudly about markets, his voice slipping into arrogance with every sentence. Claudia laughed at her own wit. Eleanor checked the diamond bracelet, making sure it caught the cabin lights. Nobody noticed the quiet way Karen's fingers brushed the edge of her tote strap, pausing at the worn patch of canvas near the top. For a moment, her thumb pressed into the seam where the fabric frayed. Then she folded her hands and stilled them. For a brief second, she let herself drift not into sleep, but into stillness deeper than the cabin could imagine. She pictured a sky with no passengers, no laughter, no sneers. Just the pulse of engines against her body, the horizon endless, her name called not with disdain but with recognition. She felt the phantom weight of a helmet against her skull, the tight seal of an oxygen mask. A memory, not a dream. But when she opened her eyes, the window beside her reflected only her hoodie, her tired ponytail, the smear of clouds beyond. She turned her face toward the glass and closed her eyes again. The flight had only begun. The cabin had settled into its rhythm. Seatbelts unclicked, laptops opening. The quiet war of elbows fought along armrests. Flight attendants pushed carts down the aisle with mechanical smiles. The world outside was a sea of pale blue and thin clouds, but inside, tension simmered beneath the hum of engines. Hoa Karen sat unmoving, her head tilted against the cold window pane, her tote pressed to her ribs. The whispers around her had quieted to murmurs, but the residue of their laughter still clung to the air, sharp as ash after smoke. She could feel their glances, the way people occasionally turned in their seats to check that she was still there, still small, still silent. Then came the voice. It cracked through the speakers in the captain's forced calm, the kind that only made hearts pound harder. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received an unidentified warning signal in our airspace. Please remain calm and stay seated. The words were simple. The silence that followed was not. For a heartbeat, the cabin froze. Coffee cups hung midair, forks paused over trays, thumbs hovered above phone screens. Then, as though a match had been dropped into dry grass, panic erupted. Passengers twisted in their seats, craning to look out the windows, hands fumbling for phones. Voices tangled into a rising storm. A man in a polo shirt shouted from the back, his face pale. "Is it terrorists?" His voice cracked, loud enough to ripple through the rows. That single word, terrorists, unlocked chaos. Graham's hand clenched on his armrest. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "I'll sue this airline if something happens." His words were not courage, only fear clothed in anger. Kayla's phone shot up, her breath quick and shallow. "You guys, this is wild. Something's happening," she whispered into her live stream, eyes wide with manufactured excitement. Her followers exploded with comments, demands for angles, theories spinning faster than the plane itself. Eleanor clutched Richard's sleeve, her bracelet clinking sharply. "We should have taken the jet," she hissed. Richard's lips thinned, his phone screen glowing as he checked news alerts that had no answers. Children cried. Flight attendants whispered into radios. The hum of the plane turned heavy, pressing down on every chest. And in the middle of it, Hoa Karen opened her eyes. Her gaze was dark, steady, like someone staring into a storm they had already survived once before. She leaned forward just enough for her lips to part. Her voice was so quiet it could have been mistaken for breath. Yet Graham heard it clearly. "Not terrorists," she whispered. "They're here for me." It was barely more than a murmur, but the words detonated in the silence. Graham turned, his face flushing red. "What did you just say?" His voice boomed across the cabin, snapping every eye toward row 22. Kayla swung her camera instantly. "Oh my God, guys, did you hear that? She thinks they're here for her." Her giggle was sharp, slicing through the fear. The frat boys in the back howled, pointing their phones at her. "Crazy lady in 22C. One shouted, and the others echoed in laughter, their voices drunk on the moment. An older woman in a cashmere sweater, Margaret, twisted in her seat with a tight smile. "Don't stir trouble, dear. Just be quiet and let the professionals handle this." Her tone dripped with the condescension of someone who believed calm equaled control. Marcus, the flight attendant, strode down the aisle, his jaw clenched, his posture stiff with authority borrowed from the uniform. He stopped beside Karen, lowering his voice to a sharp edge. "Ma'am, keep quiet or we'll report you to security when we land." The cabin roared with laughter again, feeding off itself. To them, Karen wasn't a woman in a hoodie anymore. She was a spectacle, a scapegoat to distract from their fear. From behind, a tech executive in a tailored blazer leaned forward, his grin smug. "If you're going to make up stories, at least dress the part." He gestured at her sneakers and hoodie, his voice pitched high enough to win chuckles from his row. "Heroes don't shop clearance rack." The laughter swelled, rolling like a tide. Karen's fingers tightened around the tote in her lap. She turned her head slowly toward Marcus, her gaze cutting into him with a precision that made his throat bob. Her voice was soft, but it slid through the noise like a blade through silk. "Report me." 2 words, that was all. The laughter stumbled, tripping over itself. Marcus blinked, his mouth half open, then turned sharply away, muttering about protocol as if retreat could erase the moment. The cabin shifted uneasily, the mockery not as certain as before. Karen leaned back again, eyes sliding shut. Her tote remained pressed against her, her hand brushing its zipper in a motion so small it could have been mistaken for nerves. But the storm was only beginning. A few rows up, a woman in a bright red coat stood to stretch. Vanessa, a PR executive with lips painted in crimson, glanced back at Karen, her voice dripping disdain. "Some people shouldn't be allowed in public," she said loudly. "It's embarrassing for the rest of us." She adjusted her coat so the designer label showed, tossing her hair as though claiming victory. A few passengers murmured in agreement. Karen did not move. She only adjusted the strap of her tote and rested her head once more against the glass. Vanessa smirked, pulling out her compact mirror, satisfied. Then the sound came, a low, guttural roar that did not belong to the engines of their commercial jet. It vibrated through the cabin walls, a thunder that reached into bone. Heads snapped to the windows, mouths falling open. 2 F-22 Raptors, sleek, gray, lethal, slicing through the sky with a grace that made the clouds seem clumsy. They flew so close the rivets on their wings glinted in the sun. Screams filled the cabin. Phones shot up, hands trembling. Kayla's live stream shook wildly as she tried to capture the jets. "You guys! Oh my God, fighter jets! This is insane!" Her comments exploded faster than she could read. The frat boys slammed their faces against the glass, laughing nervously. "This is some action movie shit," one shouted, but his voice cracked. Eleanor gripped Richard's hand, her diamond bracelet digging into her skin. "What is this? What's happening?" she cried. Richard had no answer, his phone useless in his hand. Marcus froze in the aisle, his radio crackling with static. His mouth opened, but no words came. Karen opened her eyes. Slower this time. She looked out the window, the light reflecting in her pupils, her lips parting just enough to let out a breath. The jets moved with her heartbeat, not against it. Steady, familiar. Her fingers traced the edge of her tote with slow precision, as if counting down seconds until the world caught up. In the back, Henry, the old veteran with trembling hands and sharp eyes, leaned forward. His glasses slipped down his nose as he squinted at the formation outside. His voice cracked but carried. "Impossible," he whispered. "That's the president's escort squad." The words were not meant for the cabin, yet they sank into it like stones into water. Silence rippled outward. A few passengers exchanged confused looks. Kayla's camera swung to him, catching the shake of his hands. Henry's eyes never left the window. It can't be, unless he stopped himself, breath-catching, his gaze drifting to Karen as if she were an answer to a question he had buried long ago. Karen did not look back. Her hand remained steady on her tote, her eyes fixed on the F-22 The storm of whispers, the panic, the laughter, all of it became distant. In that moment, there was only the rhythm of wings outside, the silence before the truth. The cabin was holding its breath, and so was the sky. The plane shivered as if the sky itself had taken a breath. Phones were still raised, some hands steady, many shaking. Children quieted the way children do when adults become strange. The two raptors held formation like unsheathed blades, their shadows sliding over the wing, dark and clean. Somewhere, a baby hiccuped and then went silent, as if even infants understood that sound could bruise the moment. Hoa Karen's reflection hovered in the window, a smudge of hoodie and loose hair, and a pair of eyes that did not blink. She exhaled once, slow enough that the glass did not fog. When she turned from the window, the cabin felt smaller, like a theater caught between scene changes, props half hidden in the wings, everyone pretending they knew what came next. Graham found his voice first. Fear had sanded it raw. "This is ridiculous," he said loud, aiming his outrage like a flare at the ceiling. "It's a stunt. Some government drill. And you?" He jabbed a finger toward 22C. "You don't get to frighten people with your little whisper games." The words tried to barrel through the aisle, but their weight fell short. Laughter bubbled up anyway, thin, defensive. Claudia supplied a brittle smile. Derek smirked as if someone had promised him easy math. Karen slid the tote fully into her lap. The canvas was soft where her palm curved. The seam at the top had split just enough to show a thready interior. Her thumb found the tear in a practice sweep. She opened the zipper 2 inches. No theatrics, no flourish. Just enough to slip 2 fingers inside and pinch cold metal from darkness. She drew it out and kept it low, letting the plastic cup's shadow soften the reflection so only the closest could truly see. A small tag, no bigger than a key fob, edges burnished from years of skin, the engraving shallow but unmistakable under the cabin lights. Night Falcon, 22. Henry inhaled like an old engine trying to catch. His hands rose from his armrest without permission, and his eyes filled in one heartbeat with the kind of water men pretend not to have. "God," he said. Not to anyone, perhaps to the rivets, the wing, the sky that had rearranged itself outside. "They said she." The rest trembled into his lip. His gaze lifted to Karen and stayed, reverent as a salute. Kayla zoomed in without understanding. "What is that?" she breathed, hungry and breathless, showing the tag to people who would screenshot and circle it in red and demand proof of what they had already decided to believe. "It's a trinket," she declared quickly, saving face. "Like Etsy for wannabes." Her laugh slipped on its own heels, falling awkwardly into silence. "Cute," said a man in a golf shirt 2 rows back, Todd, the kind of real estate grin you could hang yards of banner across. "Next she'll say she's a spy." Nervous chuckles pitched up and died. The raptor's sound filled the gaps, a patient metallic purr. Marcus appeared again, the clipped walk of someone who trusted orders more than people. "Ma'am, return to your seat and remain quiet," he said, "because scripts are made for those who have never had to write their own." The radio at his hip crackled with names that didn't travel well through static. He tried to stand tall in them and couldn't. Karen didn't look at him. She lifted the tag higher, just enough that the aisle caught the light off its face. Engraving isn't dramatic unless you've been waiting 7 years to see it. Henry made a sound like something inside his chest had finally unclenched. "Kaya," he whispered. They said Kaya. He wasn't speaking to the cabin. He was arguing with a tombstone that had never been a grave. Graham leaned into belligerence because retreat would mean a different kind of safety. "Anybody can etch metal," he scoffed. "Anybody can—" He stopped, unwilling to say the word lie out loud while the sky listened. Karen closed her fingers over the tag and rose. The motion was simple, knees unlock, weight moves forward, but the aisle felt wider when she occupied it. Marcus stepped left, then right, discovering that blocking a person without touching them is a geometry problem. She passed him with a glance that was not unkind and not forgiving. Veins in the ceiling breathed out air that smelled faintly of ice and citrus. Karen reached the galley panel the attendants had left open in their distraction, found the red toggle with her eyes before her hand bothered to join it, and pressed the transmit. Her voice came calm, not loud, a tone tuned to the pitch of people who do not need to be told who they are. This is Night Falcon 22 Charlie, requesting acknowledgement. If a word could slap, acknowledgement did. It bounced off plastic and polyester and filtered water and stunned them. There was a beat half a second or an hour when they thought nothing would answer, and then the radio gave a crackle with the personality of electricity, and the sky outside performed the quietest trick in aviation. The raptors tipped their wings, not a wave, not a flourish, just that precise, deliberate angle that says, "We see you, we hear you, we're here." It ripped the chatter out of the cabin's throat. The frat boys' phones dropped an inch as if gravity had been momentarily strengthened. Kayla's live stream froze on her own startled face. Even the ice from the beverage cart seemed to stop clinking. The only sound was the impression of speed, the way distance hisses when cut. Rachel stood. She had a journalist's posture. Chin forward, pen in hand, eyes ablaze with the kind of skepticism that had saved lives and wrecked careers. "No," she said, and the syllable wobbled before she kicked steel under it. "No, this is staged. A media stunt. No one with clearance would—" Her eyes darted to the hoodie, the frayed laces, the bruise of a threadbare tote, would present like this. She said this the way a person gestures vaguely toward any class of human they never learned to understand. Or like you imagined, Susan added too fast, color high on her jaw, lawyer voice reaching for precedent where none applied. "Where are your credentials? Verification? A proper identity check?" She addressed Karen as if cross-examining a door. Henry's laugh contained a note older than all of them. "Credentials," he murmured, not unkindly, like he was patting the head of a boy who'd ask why rain falls downward. He almost said more, and then chose reverence instead. Karen did not turn to them. She still held the button. Two. Charlie, standing by. The reply was immediate, and the voice carried the kind of warm authority that belongs to few. Not loud, not rehearsed, simply impossible to mistake. Two, Charlie, copy. Maintain present course and altitude. Glad to have you on the air. The radio clipped the last word, like a smile through static. Graham's mouth opened and did not locate words. Eleanor pressed her diamonded wrist to her throat and found her own pulse misbehaving. Richard lowered his phone, which had never been built to capture this. Marcus swayed, a metronome whose pendulum had been bumped. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else forgot, for once, to film. Inside Karen, something eased that had not had a name, even when it was all she had left. The skull-tight memory of straps and seals hemorrhaged into present oxygen. The sky rearranged itself to allow a person back in. She released the button and the cabin remembered how to breathe. "Explain it," Jeff demanded from the aisle, unable to handle a world that didn't queue up for his certainty. "Explain who you are. If you're that person, if you're this night whatever, then why hide? Why?" He ran out of why. His face tried on indignation and fear and found neither fit. He looked smaller inside them. Karen turned just enough to look at him, a glance that measured and dismissed without cruelty. "Because not every wound wants an audience," she said. "Because not every story wants to be told." She didn't add that sometimes you spend so long in a cockpit that the ground looks like a rumor. She didn't add that sometimes the world decides you died and you let it, because you need something to bury. The starboard windows blossomed with a new shape before anyone could decide whether to applaud. The sound came first, lower than the raptors, a resonance you feel in your teeth. The clouds parted on a body painted in blue and white in history, the seal bright and circular like a promise pressed into wax. People cried out not with fear but with the shock of proximity to symbol. Air Force One did not need introduction. It provided its own. The radio softened further, as if smiling now required less muscle. Night Falcon. 2-2. Welcome back. The pause afterward contained 7 years. We owe you everything. Silence in the cabin reassembled itself into something like reverence. Even Rachel's pen quieted, hanging just above the paper as if ink could bow. Kayla lowered her phone to her lap and let the comments run like wild horses without her, a stampede she could not harness. The frat boys leaned back hard, necks against headrests, gazes gone far beyond their screens. Henry covered his mouth with his strong hand and wept into it privately. It is not the size of the man that decides the size of the grief. A toddler in 14 Ampere whimpered, and his mother Emily, hair a little undone, eyes rimmed with the pink of too little sleep, rocked him and then looked up at Karen as if the aisle were a pew, and this the only church that had ever mattered. "Is it true?" she asked, voice small and rasped from shushing. "Are you her?" Karen met the young woman's eyes. The answer flickered across her features and then settled, not proud, not coy. "I'm just Karen," she said, "but I flew for you." Emily's chin trembled, and she pressed her lips to her son's hair, as if an oath could be transferred skin to skin. Around her, some people closed their eyes to adjust to the weight of meaning. Others kept their eyes open like people afraid of missing the moment they should have noticed sooner. Graham sat down. It happened without ceremony. His knees folded, and the seat took him back, and the muscles of his face stopped holding their shape. Derek leaned forward to conform his voice to a whisper, to say something about misreading a situation, about how these things happen, but no words found the runway. Claudia straightened her skirt as if the fabric had lately betrayed her. Eleanor studied the marriage of diamond to flesh and wondered, absurdly, whether stones could be ashamed. Rachel gathered herself, smoothing ethics over the part of her that had wanted to be right. "If you were reported KIA," she said, gentler now, "why are you here?" It wasn't accusation. It was the shapeless need of a world that keeps files on everything and still fails to understand. Karen's hand drifted to the tote again. She didn't open it. She only rested her palm where the photo lived, where paper had memorized the heat of two people standing shoulder to shoulder on a runway that had smelled like jet fuel and metal polish and a carbon-soft dawn. "Because once the sky required it," she said, "and once it required my absence." She tilted her head toward the window where Air Force One leveled in the near distance, escort and escorted drawing lines through morning. Today it required a name. Susan cleared her throat. The sound of someone setting down a weapon. "And the uniform?" she asked softly, because it needed asking, because symbols also require care. "It doesn't look like—" She stopped, and then, "It doesn't matter," she said, and sat down, surprising herself most of all. There was a slow reconfiguration in the rows, a physical rearrangement of belief into posture. People who had turned away turned back. People who had squared their shoulders against 22C found themselves leaning forward, not to intrude but to apologize without petition. Marcus hovered near the bulkhead and then came a step closer, then another, his radio quiet now, the script finished. "Ma'am," he said, and swallowed the uniform a little too tight suddenly across his chest. Can I bring you water? A blanket?" The offer looked small on the tray, but large in his hands. Karen shook her head. The kind of no that is not refusal so much as release. "I'm fine," she said, and meant it in the brief, perfect way a pilot means fine when everything has finally aligned. Applause does not start like thunder. It starts like rain. One pair of hands somewhere, Henry's perhaps, or Emily's, met and parted and met again, and others followed, uncertain at first, then finding the measure, then filling the cabin until it shook in a human way instead of a mechanical one. Not a standing ovation, not a basketball roar, just steady, grateful noise. Karen did not bow. Heroes bow to nobody, least of all to moments. She returned to her seat and placed the tote back under the curve of her knees. The tag lay warm in her fist. She opened her fingers and let it rest in her palm, a small moon catching cabin light. Jeff stood, last holdout of a culture that believes answers are owed at the speed of demand. "It still doesn't add up," he argued to no one in particular. "Why wouldn't you tell us before? Why make us think—" He ran headfirst into a wall he couldn't see and stopped. "I don't owe you my story," Karen said without heat, without cinders. There was no anger in it and therefore no defense against it. Jeff sat, not chastened so much as recalibrated, like a compass rediscovering north after a magnet is removed. Outside, Air Force One held its line, the Raptors a cathedral of speed around it. The captain's voice returned, less tight now, as if the cockpit had taken a sip of courage. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are coordinating with military escort for a standard approach into Washington National. Please remain seated as we continue our descent." He did not say what he wanted to say. What an honor, what a history, What a morning, but his paws carried it. Karen leaned her head back against the window. The cold had warmed under her skin. Through the glass, the wing flexed minutely, alive. In her mind, a different pane of glass held the outline of a man in a plain jacket. No tie. She could see the way he stood, as if rooms learned from him how to make space. He would be waiting. He always had been, in every absence. Kayla looked at the black mirror of her phone and did not press go live. She turned the camera around, caught her own face, did not like what she saw, and put the device face down on the tray. For the first time since she'd learned to monetize attention, she chose not to. Claudia's hands folded on her knees. The garnet polish seemed excessive, like party lights left on after a funeral. Eleanor slid her bracelet up her forearm, as if light might weigh less higher on the bone. Richard closed his news app and, in an act that cost him nothing and therefore mattered, turned his palm up for his wife to hold. Henry angled himself so the cabin could not see him cry and let it happen anyway. He looked at Karen with the tender gratitude of one soldier to another, the acknowledgement of a language civilians never learned but should honor. He did not speak her call sign again. The sky had already said it out loud. They began to descend. The earth reconsidered itself beneath them, sharpening from cloud to geometry. Lines, rivers, the glinting spine of a road, the puzzle of monuments the city kept like heirlooms. Seatbelts clicked. Children fussed and were soothed. The engine's song changed key. The Raptors widened their arc, then settled closer. Choreography so practiced it resembled instinct. Karen closed her eyes not to leave, but to stay. The cabin's air tasted cleaner. The laughter from earlier was not gone. It had been repossessed by those who had spent it. The space around 22C was no longer a ring of judgment. It was an aisle that led forward. She placed the tag back into the tote without looking. The way pianists release keys they could find again in their sleep. Her palm found the ghost of a photo through fabric and rested there. She did not need to see it to know what it contained. Morning haze, a runway, two figures who had not known yet how much of themselves would be required. "Welcome back," the radio had said. It had not specified to what. To the air, perhaps? To a name? To a truth that does not perform, only persists. The cabin tilted gently, a city slid toward them, and Hoa Karen breathed in as if oxygen had finally remembered her face. The descent steadied, the seatbelt sign glowing amber overhead. The cabin buzzed with nervous whispers that trailed off whenever eyes wandered back to 22C. Hoa Karen sat motionless, head resting against the window, tote curled into her lap. The silence around her wasn't the old silence of contempt. It was something heavier, an awareness, a reluctant reverence like the hush in a church when someone realizes the stained glass isn't just decoration, it's history carved in color. Jeff, still flushed with restless doubt, shifted in his seat, arms flailing for words. "It doesn't make sense," he insisted to anyone who would listen, his voice climbing desperate. "If you're some hero, why hide? Why sit there like you're nothing?" His hands chopped the air, trying to cleave the moment back into a world where appearances dictated worth. Karen turned her face just enough for her voice to reach him. Calm, soft, so steady it carried further than shouting. "I don't owe you my story." The sentence landed like a weight across the cabin, silencing even the hum of speculation. No anger, no explanation, just a truth so complete it didn't ask for agreement. Jeff's mouth closed. He sank into his seat, a man smaller than his question. Applause sparked from somewhere forward, timid at first, then joined by others. Hands met hands, uncertain, then confident, until the sound filled the aisle, vibrating the very panels above their heads. For once, the applause wasn't for a spectacle or a performance. It was gratitude for silence defended, for dignity revealed. Karen didn't acknowledge it. She closed her eyes again, the tag warm in her palm, and the tote heavy with a history no one on that plane could carry for her. Memory unspooled quietly behind her eyelids. She saw dawn on a tarmac, the horizon painted orange, the air sharp with jet fuel. She was younger then, helmet under her arm, her call sign painted on the cockpit just below the canopy. Night Falcon 22. Engines roared behind her as crews prepped for the mission, the biggest of her life escort detail for Air Force One. She remembered the weight of the oxygen mask sealing across her face, the steady voice in her earpiece, The president's plane gleaming white-blue against the rising sun. Then fire. A missile that came too close. The split-second maneuver that saved one aircraft while crippling her own. The world tilting, alarms screaming, the cockpit filling with smoke. The choice to disappear rather than let them turn her survival into spectacle. The report, Kia. The funeral she never attended. She had walked away from the ashes with only a tag in her hand and a man's steady arm around her shoulders. A man who would become her husband. Together they built anonymity like a shelter, living in shadows where her name couldn't be touched. She let the world forget, because sometimes forgetting is mercy. Her fingers brushed the creased photo buried in the tote, the one she had pulled out quietly before the chaos. A younger version of herself, in crisp uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder with him. The photo smelled faintly of oil and dust, memory locked in paper. The cabin shifted again, unable to hold silence for long. Ethan, the grad student in glasses who had sat quietly with his book all flight, finally stood. His hands trembled as he held up the volume. A History of Military Aviation. The page open was marked with a black and white photo. A young woman in flight gear, helmet under one arm. The caption beneath reading, Captain Hoa, Night Falcon, Karen, reported killed in action during Operation Sentinel, 2012. I read about her. Ethan stammered, eyes wide, voice cracking. About you. They said you saved Air Force One. They said you died. The book quivered in his grip. The cabin tilted toward him, heads craning to see. Doubt flickered again in a few eyes, but it was brittle now, a flame running out of fuel. Karen didn't look at him, but her hands stilled on the tote, acknowledging without words. Ethan swallowed hard, lowering himself back into his seat, his book trembling on his knees. Applause rose again, but softer this time, more reverent, less desperate. Some passengers clapped. Some simply bowed their heads. Henry sat straighter, tears carving clean lines down his cheeks, and whispered something only veterans whisper. Welcome home. The city began to rise beneath them, bridges threading rivers, monuments like teeth against the skyline. The captain's voice returned, less strained, almost reverent. Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing our final approach into Washington. Please remain seated as we coordinate with our escort. People complied instantly, their defiance burned out, their fear reformed into awe. The F-22 second banked slightly, choreography smooth as breath. Air Force One slid ahead, leading them like a shepherd through the air. Inside, nobody mocked anymore. Instead, unease turned inward. Graham sat pale, his hands limp in his lap, realizing the weight of his sneer. Claudia smoothed her skirt in silence, unable to scrub away words she'd spoken too loudly. Kayla stared at her phone, her chat feed still exploding, but she didn't dare lift it again. The frat boys avoided each other's eyes. Eleanor held Richard's hand for the first time without irony. Even Marcus, the attendant, lingered by the galley, his radio silent, his jaw no longer tight with disdain. He watched Karen with something fragile in his eyes, an apology he didn't know how to deliver. The landing gear dropped with a thud. The cabin jolted, oxygen masks rattling in their compartments above, and then the wheels found earth. The aircraft roared down the runway, brakes hissing, wings flexing. A collective exhale filled the cabin as if lungs had been clenched for hours. The plane slowed, taxiing toward the terminal. Through the windows, passengers saw flashing lights, rows of black SUVs, a sea of reporters with cameras already raised. News vans lined the tarmac. Security clustered like a dark tide against the gate. Phones came up again, but now shakily, reverently. Some tried to film, others only watched. The story they thought was theirs had become something else entirely. Karen rose slowly, sliding the tote strap over her shoulder. She didn't rush, didn't speak. As she stepped into the aisle, people moved aside instinctively, not in deference to spectacle, but to gravity itself. She passed Graham's row, his eyes darted down to his watch, suddenly heavy on his wrist. She passed Kayla, whose phone slipped from her hands to the carpet with a hollow crack. She passed Claudia, who clasped her manicured hands so tight the polish threatened to chip. None of them dared say a word. Karen's sneakers squeaked softly on the jet bridge as she walked out, her tote swaying gently against her hip. Behind her, the cabin remained hushed, their lives rearranged, their judgments dissolving like fog under sunlight. And ahead, the world waited, cameras flashing, headlines already screaming, a storm she would not feed with words. She had given them silence. She would keep it. The jet bridge trembled faintly under the weight of flashbulbs waiting beyond. Reporters jostled at the cordon, cameras angled, microphones thrust forward like spears hungry for blood. The tarmac shimmered with flashing lights from government SUVs and news vans. What had begun as an ordinary shuttle flight had transformed into a rolling headline, and every lens was aimed at the same figure stepping out of row 22. Hoa Karen moved with no hurry, no show of force. The hoodie still hung loose on her frame, sneakers still scuffed, totes slung casually against her side. To the watching crowd, it seemed an insult to expectation heroes were supposed to wear uniforms or medals, not wrinkles and faded fabric. Yet the hush that traveled through the terminal was proof enough. She didn't need the costume. A man in a blazer Graham stayed back in the cabin doorway. His phone buzzed in his hand, and when he answered, his complexion drained. "Fired?" he repeated, voice shrill enough for those nearby to hear. He looked around in disbelief, his watch glinting uselessly. The call ended. He sagged into a seat, undone by one word Karen hadn't even spoken. Behind him, Kayla clutched her phone like a weapon gone hot. Notifications blared millions of views, but none in her favor. Clips of her mocking Karen had been ripped from her livestream, circulating faster than wildfire. Sponsors had pulled their banners overnight, comment sections turning into pyres. She pressed the screen to her chest, as if holding it closer might shield her from the collapse of the empire she had built on ridicule. Claudia, the consultant, walked stiffly down the aisle, her phone glued to her ear. "I understand," she whispered into the line. "It's just a misunderstanding." Her face whitened. The client she had bragged about all flight had cut her loose. She ended the call and sat down heavily on an empty seat near the gate, hands trembling against her designer bag. The frat boys huddled together, muttering curses as they deleted videos from their feeds. Too late. Alumni had already forwarded the footage to their chapter director. Their social accounts blinked offline one by one. They stared at their blank screens as if the silence of the internet was a new kind of death. Marcus, the attendant, stood alone near the galley. A supervisor approached, whispered in his ear, and walked away with a tight face. Marcus's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Word had already spread through airline channels. Reassigned to ground duty, his career clipped not by turbulence, but by arrogance. The dominoes fell quietly, one after another, like rain dripping from a roof, and Karen never looked back. On the terminal floor, the crowd parted when she appeared, as though gravity itself rearranged. Photographers shouted her name, the sharp crack of shutters puncturing the air. "Captain Karen!" "Night Falcon!" one reporter screamed. Another, "Where have you been? Why now?" She answered none of them. Her steps were even, sneakers whispering against linoleum, tote bumping gently against her hip. Silence was her weapon, and it cut cleaner than any explanation. Then the sea shifted. From the far side of the cordon, a man stepped through. No uniform, no medals, just a plain jacket and a presence that hushed the air. He carried himself like someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command attention. Shoulders squared, jaw steady, eyes that knew exactly where she was in the crowd. Her husband, Karen's eyes softened for the first time since the sky had cracked open. She didn't run, didn't break. She only met him at the center, where the noise collapsed into something fragile. He didn't kiss her, didn't embrace her, not in front of the cameras. He simply brushed his hand against hers, a small touch that was louder than thunder. The crowd felt it, even if they didn't understand. A burly security officer approached, his badge gleaming under the terminal lights. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice edged with nerves. "We've got a car waiting. Orders from the top." He gestured to a black SUV idling outside, its windows tinted, driver standing stiff at attention. Karen nodded once. Her husband stepped beside her, their hands brushing again. Together they moved forward. Reporters lunged, microphones thrust, flashes exploding, but the crowd itself parted as if unwilling to touch the silence that wrapped around her. She ducked into the SUV without a word, the door closing softly behind her. The vehicle eased into motion, swallowed by the convoy. Behind them, the cameras kept flashing at an empty space. The terminal lingered in silence long after the convoy disappeared. Inside, passengers from Flight 227 slumped in their seats, drained. The applause had ended, leaving only the echo of it in their heads. For some, the silence was shame. For others, relief. Henry, the old veteran, sat alone near a window. He had cried quietly through the landing, and now he wiped his face with a trembling hand. A whisper left his lips, not for others but for himself. She came home. He stared out at the sky until it blurred into light. Ethan sat a few rows over, his book open to the page with her photo. He traced the lines of her younger face with a fingertip, reverent, like a believer finally seeing a saint walk through the church doors. His eyes glowed not with fandom, but with conviction. Legends were real. Kayla, on the other hand, scrolled furiously through her notifications, her own voice screaming back at her from countless reposted clips. She tried to type an apology but stopped, deleting it. Words could not erase laughter once carved into the air. Her empire had collapsed in the span of one flight, and she knew it would not rise again. Graham's phone buzzed once more. A final confirmation from the company board. Termination letter, client severed, reputation in tatters. He leaned forward, head in his hands, the weight of his arrogance finally pressing him into silence. Marcus lingered by the jet bridge until the last passenger left. His uniform still looked neat, but it felt heavier now, the stripes on his sleeve a reminder of the authority he had misused. Ground duty awaited him. No sky, no flights, no second chances. The city outside moved on traffic horns, office chatter, life flowing around the spectacle. The headlines were already screaming, "Mystery passenger 22C identified as Night Falcon hero." Clips of Air Force One's salute were replayed on every network. Social feeds flooded with disbelief, awe, and regret. Karen didn't see any of it. She sat quietly in the back of the SUV, tote on her lap, her husband beside her. Her hand found the photo inside, fingertips brushing its worn edges. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need apologies. The truth was enough. The convoy rolled on, engines steady, carrying her back into a world that had already begun to rewrite its judgment. The SUV's interior hummed softly, insulated from the chaos it left behind. Outside, flashes still streaked the air as reporters tried to chase the convoy, their voices muffled into silence as the tinted windows swallowed them whole. Inside, only the steady thrum of tires on asphalt and the measured breathing of two people remained. Hoa Karen sat with her tote pressed lightly to her lap, her gaze drifting out the window where the city blurred into streaks of concrete and light. The hoodie still clung to her shoulders, her sneakers still bore their scuffs, but the weight of the cabin's ridicule had fallen away. She wasn't 22C anymore. She wasn't anyone's punchline. She was herself whole, quiet, seen. Her husband rested his hand near hers on the seat, not demanding, not clutching. Just there. Their fingers brushed once, an unspoken exchange. No cameras to catch it, no audience to applaud. It was for them alone, the private gravity that had steadied her through the years she'd chosen silence. Karen slipped her hand into the tote. Not hurried, not hesitant. From its soft interior, she pulled the small metal tag, the engraving dulled but still clear. Night Falcon 22. She turned it over in her palm, the metal cool against her skin. In her other hand, she unfolded the creased photograph. The colors had faded, edges softened with time, but the memory was sharp, her younger self in crisp uniform, standing on a tarmac beside the man who now sat beside her. Both had been steady then, though neither knew how much the sky would demand. She smiled, a small thing, a private curve of lips. Not triumph, not pride, just recognition. The world outside could write its headlines and splice its clips, but this was the truth. She had not returned for applause. She had returned because the sky had called her name, and she had answered. The SUV slowed at a red light. Pedestrians on the sidewalk paused as the convoy idled, some raising phones, others simply staring. Behind the tinted glass, Karen lifted her eyes to the clouds overhead. The sky stretched wide and pale, limitless, as if it had been waiting all this time. Her husband glanced at her, his voice low. meant only for her. You don't have to go back. Karen's eyes stayed on the sky, steady. I never left, she said softly. The light turned green. The SUV eased forward, swallowed by the current of the city. Karen folded the photo carefully and slipped it back into the tote, letting the tag rest on top. She leaned against the seat, closing her eyes for just a moment, the hum of the engine blending with the faint echo of wings that had once cut through clouds for her alone. She didn't need rescuing. Never had. Her silence had been enough. Her truth had always been enough. And somewhere far above, the sky held her name still, waiting.